close your eyes and picture a land before highways, before skyscrapers, before even the idea of America existed. A vast wilderness, rolling plains, dense forests, snow-covered peaks, and sun-scorched deserts stretched out for thousands of miles, around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. During the last ice age, small bands of humans crossed a land bridge known as Beringia that once connected Siberia to Alaska. They followed herds of mammoth and caribou into a new world. Some stayed in the north, but many journeyed southward, gradually populating the entire continent. One of the most impressive cities of the ancient world sat right near modern-day St. Louis, Cahokia. Places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde still inspire awe today. A union of 5, later 6, nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, the Iroquois, governed through a system of representative democracy and checks on power. Sound familiar? Their governance influenced the framers of the U.S. Constitution centuries later. They built igloos from snow, used dog sleds for travel, and hunted whales and seals for food and tools. In California, the Chumash and Miwok peoples fished and harvested acorns, building complex social structures along the coast. In the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit and Haida carved massive totem poles and held potlatches, ceremonial feasts that displayed their wealth and redistributed it throughout the community. There were wars, alliances, migrations, and upheavals. Just like in Europe or Asia, power shifted between tribes. Some civilizations rose to dominate, while others declined or moved on. In other words, America before Europeans was not a blank page waiting to be written. It was a complex, dynamic tapestry of cultures. These were societies that planned for droughts, tracked celestial movements, and engineered vast irrigation systems to support agriculture in one of the continent's harshest climates. For now, it's essential to understand this foundational truth. Indigenous peoples were the first Americans. Then imagine not just surviving, but creating cities, governments, artworks, and entire languages that passed from generation to generation. That's the legacy of America's first peoples. They were farmers, builders, philosophers, warriors, artists, and leaders. Their contributions did not end with colonization. They shaped this continent for thousands of years and continue to shape it today. The introduction of horses transformed their way of life, but even before then, these tribes had developed spiritual systems, seasonal migration patterns, and communal living practices that were deeply sustainable. At its peak around the year 1100 AD, Cahokia may have had more than 20,000 residents, more than London at the time. Its massive earthen pyramids, plazas, and astronomical observatories point to a sophisticated society with deep religious, political, and economic systems. The Amazon rainforest, many parts are actually man-made forests cultivated over thousands of years. Most tribes believed in a close connection to the land, animals, and the elements. Spirits inhabited rivers, mountains, and even individual trees. Ancestors watched over the living, and ceremonies marked the changing seasons, births, deaths, and victories in war. There was no single Native American religion, but there was a common thread: a deep respect for the interconnectedness of life. In North America, controlled burns were used to manage forests and grasslands, encouraging growth of plants and improving hunting conditions. These were not passive stewards of nature, they were active engineers. Trade networks stretched thousands of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. This was North America, tens of thousands of years ago, and though the maps were blank, this land was anything but empty. Long before any European ever set eyes on the continent, it was home to millions of people. They didn't arrive all at once. These early peoples didn't just survive, they thrived. They developed unique cultures, languages, and ways of life, adapted to every environment, from the Arctic tundra to the swamps of Florida. At the time of Columbus's arrival, it's estimated that there were over 600 distinct Native American tribes, speaking more than 300 different languages. Let's take a closer look at some of these civilizations, beginning with the mound builders of the Mississippi River Valley. To the southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, sometimes called the Anasazi, built cliffside cities and sprawling complexes out of adobe and stone. In the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy formed one of the most advanced political organizations of the pre-Columbian world. Further west, tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne mastered the Great Plains, living in harmony with the bison herds. To the north, the Inuit developed a way of life perfectly adapted to the Arctic. Contrary to the myth of the noble savage living in untouched wilderness, Native American societies actively shaped their environments. The spiritual life of these communities was rich and diverse. We must also remember that this world was not static. When Europeans eventually arrived, they stepped into a land full of people, politics, and stories. But that part of the story is for later. To get a sense of their ingenuity, imagine trying to survive in a place with no grocery stores, no electricity, no GPS, no roads. The story of the United States before European contact is a rich and complex tapestry woven by countless indigenous peoples who thrived across the continent for thousands of years. To truly grasp the beginnings of what would become America, we must first step back to understand these ancient civilizations, their cultures, innovations, and the landscapes they shaped. Long before Columbus set sail in 1492, North America was home to diverse Native American tribes and nations, each with distinct languages, customs, and social structures. Known for building large earthen mounds used for ceremonial and political purposes, the Mississippians developed complex societies with hierarchical leadership, extensive trade networks, and impressive craftsmanship. Their city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was the largest pre-Columbian urban center north of Mexico, home to tens of thousands at its peak. From the nomadic hunter-gatherers of the Arctic to the sophisticated agricultural societies of the Southwest and Mississippi River Valley, indigenous peoples adapted ingeniously to their environments. Yet, understanding this pre-contact history honors the resilience and contributions of Native Americans, reminding us that America's story began long before European arrival. One of the most remarkable early cultures was the Mississippian civilization, flourishing around 800 to 1600 CE in what is now the southeastern United States. Their sustainable agricultural practices, including the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash the Three Sisters, supported stable communities and rich biodiversity. Their legacy includes stunning architectural sites like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, evidence of advanced planning and communal life. Farther north, the Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful alliance of 6 Native American nations, fostered a system of governance and diplomacy that influenced American political thought centuries later. Meanwhile, in the Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones, often referred to as the Anasazi, built remarkable cliff dwellings and intricate irrigation systems in the arid deserts. Across the vast continent, indigenous peoples maintained a deep spiritual connection to the land, viewing it as a shared resource rather than private property. European exploration and eventual colonization would profoundly disrupt these societies. This foundation sets the stage for the next chapter, the era of European exploration and the first. Encounters between native peoples and settlers, which would forever change the continent's destiny. In the early 1700s, life in the British American colonies was undergoing a dramatic shift. What began as a collection of ragtag settlements was evolving into a more stable, complex society. But compared to the rigid class systems of Europe, the colonies offered opportunity. Land was more available, and a man's success was increasingly based on his effort and connections, not just his birth. This began to shape a uniquely American identity: practical, independent, and ambitious. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Axle were attempts by Parliament to extract revenue from the colonies without giving them representation. In 1770, tensions boiled over in Boston, where British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Just 3 years later, a group of patriots dressed as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party shocked the British establishment and led directly to the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. The slogan "No taxation without representation" wasn't tea. Just catchy, it captured the growing sense that the colonies were being treated like subjects, not citizens. In 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. France, seeing an opportunity to wound its rival, one forged in revolution, built on ideals, but shadowed by contradictions like slavery, inequality, and exclusion. The next phase of America's story would be one of building, testing, and defining what it meant to be a country of by and for the people. Joined the American cause in 1778, with French aid and persistence. The colonists finally forced a British surrender at Yorktown in 1781, 2 years later. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. They weren't calling for independence yet, but they were coordinating a unified response to British policies. Led by voices like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, they drafted a document that would change history, the Declaration of Independence. Adopted on July 4th, it proclaimed that all men are created equal. The governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive, the people have a right to alter or abolish it. Population growth was explosive. Between 1700 and 1770, the number of colonists grew from about 250,000 to more than 2 million. The British Empire was the most powerful military force in the world, and it didn't take kindly to rebellion. But the American colonists had home field advantage, grit, and leadership. George Washington, a planter and former soldier, took command of the Continental Army and led a years-long struggle full of setbacks, improvisation, and sheer will. They were met by colonial militias, ordinary farmers, and tradesmen. Shots were fired. No one knows who fired first, but the shot heard round the world had been fired. The American Revolutionary War had begun. This wasn't just due to natural births immigrants poured in from England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and Africa, creating a diverse and often divided colonial population. Life in the colonies wasn't easy. Farming was backbreaking, disease common, and infant mortality high. Meanwhile, global politics were creeping into colonial life. Britain and France were locked in a centuries-long rivalry, and the colonies were caught in the crossfire. The most important clash in North America came with the French, an Indian War. A brutal conflict that was part of a global struggle known as the 7 Years' War. It pitted British colonists and their native allies against the French and their own native allies. With both sides vying for control of land and trade routes, the war ended in a British victory, but it came at a steep cost. Britain gained vast new territories, including Canada and much of the interior of North America. But the war left the British government deeply in debt. To pay off those debts, they turned to the colonies. What followed was a series of taxes and regulations that lit a fuse under colonial discontent. Resistance grew. Colonial assemblies protested, pamphlets were published, mobs formed. These events pushed the colonies to the brink. But they also brought them together. Then came April, 1775. British troops marched on Lexington and Concord to seize colonial weapons. The following summer, in 1776, the Continental Congress took the boldest step of all. It was a stunning rebuke to monarchy. It wasn't just words behind them, it was a brutal war. The war dragged on. There were a Heiseless surprise attack at Trenton, the victory at Saratoga and Lowe's, like the freezing, starving winter at Valley Forge. The United States of America was born, but winning independence was only the beginning. Now came the challenge of building a new nation. In the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, the United States faced the enormous challenge of transforming itself from a collection of rebellious colonies into a functioning nation. The victory at Yorktown in 1781 was a monumental achievement, but independence did not bring immediate peace or prosperity. Instead, the fledgling nation was beset by economic turmoil, its political uncertainty, and questions about its identity and future. Led by Daniel Shays, they took up arms in protest, shutting down courts and demanding relief. The rebellion exposed the fragility of the government and alarmed the country's leaders. If the government couldn't maintain order, how could it survive? To address concerns, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were added in 1791. The 3/5 compromise counted enslaved. People as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation, illustrating how deeply slavery was woven into the fabric of the nation. These amendments guaranteed fundamental freedoms such as speech, religion, and the press, protecting citizens from government overreach. His leadership set important precedents, including stepping down after 2 terms, establishing norms that shaped American democracy for centuries. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, advocated for states' rights and sympathized more with France. Britain, despite losing the war, maintained a military presence in the Northwest Territory and restricted American trade through impressment of sailors, seizing them for service in the British Navy. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 set a precedent for orderly settlement and admission of new states. It was a time of optimism and uncertainty, where the promise of liberty coexisted with the deep flaws of inequality and exclusion. The young nation was growing, but so were tensions between settlers and Native Americans, between federal authority and local control, and between ideals and realities. This rivalry would define the nation's early political landscape. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, championed a bold financial plan to stabilize the economy through federal assumption of state debts, creation of a national bank, and promotion of industry. These policies sparked fierce debates about the scope of federal power and the future direction of the country. The first attempt to govern the new country was the Articles of Confederation. It's adopted in 1781. This document created a loose confederation of states with a weak central government. Congress had limited powers. It could conduct diplomacy and manage Western lands, but lacked authority to tax or regulate commerce effectively. This arrangement soon revealed its weaknesses. The system of checks and balances ensured no one branch could dominate. The Great Compromise resolved representation issues by creating a bicameral Congress. The House of Representatives based on population, the Senate with equal representation from each state. States acted more like independent countries than parts of a unified nation, often competing against each other economically and politically. One vivid example of this chaos was Shays' Rebellion in 1786-87. Farmers in Massachusetts, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, were drowning in debt and facing harsh taxes. The need for a stronger federal government became urgent. In 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia for what would become the Constitutional Convention. Their mission was to fix the Articles of Confederation, but they quickly realized that minor tweaks wouldn't suffice. The delegates debated fiercely over the shape and powers of the new government. Should it be a strong central authority, or maintain state sovereignty? How would representation be allocated, by population or equally among states? What rights and freedoms should be guaranteed? Out of these debates emerged the U.S. Constitution, a remarkable compromise, balancing federal and state powers and establishing three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. However, the Constitution initially left many questions unanswered, especially regarding individual rights and slavery. Slavery, though, remained a painful contradiction. The Constitution permitted the continuation of the institution without directly addressing it, setting the stage for future conflict. With the new government in place, George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president in 1789. Washington's administration faced daunting challenges: establishing a stable economy, managing foreign relations, and quelling domestic unrest. Meanwhile, political factions began to form.
Now the Federalists, led by Hamilton, favored a strong central government and closer ties with Britain.
Foreign affairs tested the young nation's resolve. French Revolution polarized Americans, with some supporting the French cause and others fearing its violence. In the midst of these struggles, the United States also began expanding westward. This era laid the groundwork for America's political institutions and tested the durability of its revolutionary ideals. As the 19th century dawned, the United States stood at a crossroads, a young republic bursting with potential, yet grappling with deep contradictions. The third president took office in 1801 with a vision of an agrarian Republican America rooted in farming, individual liberty, and limited government. Innovations like the cotton gin, steamboats, canals, and railroads revolutionized transportation and production, knitting the vast country together. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney made cotton processing vastly more efficient, fueling a boom in cotton production and a corresponding expansion of slavery in the South. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. It's maintaining a fragile balance. It's also established the 3,630 line, north of which slavery was banned in the Louisiana Territory. This temporary fix masked deeper conflicts about states' rights, federal authority, and human liberty. The Second Great Awakening, a widespread religious revival, swept the nation, inspiring new denominations and movements focused on individual salvation and social reform. Yet beneath the surface, the unresolved conflicts over slavery, expansion, and governance festered. These tensions would soon erupt into sectional strife and ultimately civil war. This spiritual energy fueled abolitionism, temperance, women's rights, and education reform, planting seeds for future social change. As cotton fields spread, so did the brutal institution that upheld it, entrenching the South's social and economic order. Jackson, a war hero and populist, championed the common man against elites, expanding suffrage to most white men and reshaping political participation. His presidency was controversial, marked by the Indian Removal Act, which forced thousands of Native Americans from their homelands in the tragic Trail of Tears, as well as fierce battles over the national bank and tariffs. However, these advances also deepened regional disparities. The industrializing North contrasted sharply with the plantation economy of the South. Tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Seminole faced relentless pressure to cede land and move west. Despite adopting some European American ways, creating written languages, constitutions, and farms, they were subjected to forced removal and violence. One of his landmark achievements was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, a bold move that doubled the nation's size overnight for just $15 million. The U.S. acquired a vast territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, opening the door for westward expansion and settlement. This deal was both a diplomatic masterstroke and a constitutional stretch. As the Constitution didn't explicitly authorize land purchases, the early 1800s would prove to be a transformative period, defined by territorial expansion, political evolution, economic innovation, growing tensions that foreshadowed the nation's greatest crisis. Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson also commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the newly acquired lands, map routes to the Pacific, and establish relations with Native American tribes. Political life grew increasingly partisan. The Federalist Party, once dominant, began to fade after the War of 1812, giving way to the era of good feelings marked by a temporary lull in partisan conflict. However, beneath the surface, sectionalism divisions based on geography, economy, and culture was intensifying, particularly over the issue of slavery. Their journey captured the American imagination, often called America's Second War of Independence, was a defining moment. Provoked by British impressment of American sailors and interference with trade, the conflict tested the young nation's resilience. Despite setbacks, including the burning of Washington, D.C., the war ended in a stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. Yet, it boosted national pride, spurred manufacturing, and cemented a sense of American identity separate from Europe, blending adventure, scientific discovery, and the promise of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to span the continent. Meanwhile, the War of 1812 itself, economic changes accelerated during this period. The market revolution transformed the American economy from localized, subsistence-based activity to a more interconnected system of trade, manufacturing, and finance. Slavery became an increasingly volatile issue. Efforts to balance free and slave states in Congress led to a series of legislative compromises. Politically, the era witnessed the rise of Andrew Jackson and the birth of modern American democracy. The Native American story in this era is a powerful reminder of the costs of expansion. Culturally, the early 19th century was a vibrant time. As we approached the mid-1800s, the United States looked like a nation on the rise, energetic and democratic. By the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation poised between rapid growth and deepening division. The question of slavery, territorial expansion, and political power dominated the national conversation, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The idea of manifest destiny America, supposed destiny to spread across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, captured the public imagination. This belief justified aggressive expansion, fueled wars, and intensified disputes over whether new territories would permit slavery. This era, filled with fiery debates, landmark legislation, and rising tensions, set the stage for the most devastating conflict in American history, the Civil War. The 1840s and 1850s were decades of dramatic change, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers in those territories to vote on slavery. The 1850s were tumultuous. The Whig Party collapsed, and the new Republican Party emerged, founded on opposition to slavery's expansion. Abraham Lincoln, a self-taught lawyer from Illinois, rose to prominence in this party, advocating against the spread of slavery while stopping short of immediate abolition. This led to violent clashes, known as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought bloody battles, foreshadowing the national conflict to come. The court ruled that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights to sue in federal court, and that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. This decision invalidated efforts to limit slavery's spread and outraged many Northerners, an idea of signaling to the South that their political influence was waning. Attempts at compromise failed. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the Civil War erupted, a brutal 4-year struggle over the survival of the Union and the fate of slavery. In response, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860. Soon, 6 other Southern states followed, forming the Confederate States of America under President Jefferson Davis. Secession states withdrawing from the Union gained traction. Among Southern politicians and citizens who believed their way of life was under attack, one of the most significant events was the annexation of Texas. Originally part of Mexico, Texas declared independence in 1836, becoming the Republic of Texas. John Brown, a radical abolitionist, led a failed raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859. His aim was to incite a slave rebellion. Though unsuccessful, Brown's actions heightened fears in the South of Northern aggression and intensified sectional hatred. After nearly a decade as an independent nation, it was admitted to the Union in 1845. Provoking anger from Mexico and sparking the Mexican-American War, the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which added vast territories: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, paid for several other states to the United States. These new lands reignited the fierce debate over slavery. Would these territories allow enslaved people or be free? The Wilmot Proviso, proposed in 1846, sought to ban slavery in all lands gained from Mexico, but it failed to pass. The nation's fragile balance teetered. In 1850, a series of laws known as the Compromise of 1850 attempted to ease tensions. It admitted California as a free state, allowed new territories to decide on slavery through popular sovereignty, ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and enacted a stricter fugitive slave law that mandated citizens to assist in capturing escaped enslaved people. The fugitive slave law enraged Northerners, who saw it as a moral abomination and a direct threat to their freedoms. The situation escalated further with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, politically. Meanwhile, Southern leaders increasingly viewed the North's growing power and abolitionist sentiment as existential threats. The Supreme Court further inflamed tensions with the 1857 Dred Scott decision. Amidst this charged atmosphere, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final catalyst. Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. The nation was shattered. This conflict would not only decide the future of the United States, but would reshape its society, its politics, and identity forever. The American Civil War, lasting from 1861 to 1865, was the defining conflict in the nation's history, a brutal, bloody struggle that would determine the fate of the Union and the institution of slavery. It was a war that tested the resilience of the American people, challenged military innovation, and reshaped the political and social fabric of the country. The fort was a symbol of federal authority in the rebellious South, and its fall galvanized the North into action. The North boasted a larger population, greater industrial capacity, more extensive rail networks, and a robust navy. The Confederate forces, led by generals like Thomas Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee, demonstrated their tactical prowess and resolve. The war was going to be longer and bloodier than anyone had anticipated. The South, however, had the advantage of fighting a defensive war on familiar terrain, motivated by the desire to preserve their way of life and independence. Often called the War's turning point, this three-day battle in Pennsylvania was the bloodiest of the entire conflict. With over 50,000 casualties, the Union's victory halted Lee. This invasion of the North and shifted momentum in favor of the Union. President Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, setting in motion a conflict that would engulf the nation. The war began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. At the outset, the Union and the Confederacy were unevenly matched. Early battles, such as the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861, shattered the North's expectation of a quick victory. Robert E. Lee emerged as the most iconic Confederate commander, respected for his leadership, strategic insight, deep personal loyalty to Virginia. Despite his allegiance to the South, Lee was conflicted. Once stating that he could not raise his hand against his home state, Grant, initially a mediocre officer, distinguished himself in the Western theater with victories at Fort Donelson and Vicksburg, gaining a reputation for relentless determination. In 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as commander of all Union armies, entrusting him with the task of defeating Lee's forces. His military genius would shape much of the war's course. On the Union side, leaders like Ulysses S. Grant gradually rose to prominence. One of the war's defining moments came with the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. Following Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address, a short but powerful speech redefining the war as a struggle for a new birth of freedom and the preservation of democracy itself. His words resonated deeply, inspiring soldiers and civilians alike. The war was not only fought on battlefields, but also in the homes and communities across the nation. It tore families apart, disrupted economies, and brought unimaginable suffering. Soldiers faced brutal conditions, disease, and the horrors of modern warfare, including trench combat and artillery bombardments. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Lincoln on January 1, 1863, marked a crucial shift in the war's purpose. It declared all enslaved people in Confederate-held territories to be free, transforming the conflict from a fight to preserve the Union into a battle for human liberation and contentious attempt to rebuild the South, integrate formerly enslaved people into society, and redefine citizenship and rights. But the legacy of the war, its victories and failures, would echo through generations. Their participation challenged prevailing racial attitudes and laid groundwork for future civil rights struggles. Though it did not immediately free all enslaved people, it paved the way for the eventual abolition of slavery and allowed black men to join the Union Army and Navy. The Union's strategy of total war, epitomized by General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea, aimed to destroy the South's economic and psychological capacity to fight. And Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, effectively ending the war. The nation had survived, but at an enormous cost. Over 600,000 Americans dead, countless wounded, and a society forever altered. Sherman's campaign through Georgia left a path of destruction, targeting infrastructure, plantations, and supplies. African American soldiers played a vital role in the Union war effort, fighting bravely in segregated units despite facing discrimination and lower pay. As the war dragged on, both sides endured heavy losses. By 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted and fragmented. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell to Union forces in April. The aftermath of the Civil War ushered in the Reconstruction era, a complex. The conclusion of the Civil War, in 1865, marked the beginning of one of the most complex and transformative periods in American history, Reconstruction. This era, spanning roughly from 1865 to 1877, was a time of enormous hope. The Emancipation Proclamation had declared enslaved people in rebelling states free. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States. However, freedom alone was insufficient without legal protections, economic opportunities, and social equality. And profound struggle as the nation sought to heal its wounds, rebuild the devastated South, and redefine the meaning of freedom and citizenship. At the heart of Reconstruction was the urgent question of what to do with millions of newly freed African Americans. African Americans eagerly pursued schooling as a path to empowerment and economic independence. Often composed of freedmen, Reconstruction faced fierce opposition. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using violence and intimidation to suppress black political activity and maintain white dominance. These groups targeted African Americans, exposed the limits of legal and political change without broad societal support, and revealed the enduring challenges of race and democracy. Republican officials and allies spreading terror to undermine Reconstruction efforts. Northern carpetbaggers, especially as economic troubles and political scandals distracted national attention, segregation, and disenfranchisement that would last well into the 20th century. Southern states enacted poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses to prevent black citizens from voting. While separate and unequal facilities became the norm, the disputed presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden led to the Compromise of 1877, which effectively ended Reconstruction. In exchange for Hayes's presidency, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, leaving African Americans vulnerable to disenfranchisement and segregation, and Southern scalawags worked to rebuild infrastructure, reform legal systems, and expand voting rights. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Further expanding political participation for African American men, freedmen's schools, often supported by Northern missionaries and aid organizations, spread throughout the South, establishing the foundations of black education that would persist despite fierce opposition. President Abraham Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 thrust Vice President Andrew Johnson into office. Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, favored a lenient approach to Reconstruction. They sought to ensure civil rights for free people and to restructure Southern society. This conflict led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to African Americans, and the 14th Amendment, which solidified these rights in the Constitution. African American communities showed remarkable resilience. They built churches, schools, businesses, and political organizations, laying the groundwork for future civil rights movements. Leaders such as Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, and later W.E.B. Du Bois emerged, offering varied strategies to combat racism and uplift their people. He quickly moved to restore Southern states with minimal changes, allowing former Confederates to regain political power. The Bureau provided food, shelter, medical care, education, and legal assistance, playing a crucial role in the early years of Reconstruction. Despite facing significant resistance and underfunding, enact restrictive black codes that severely limited African Americans' rights and freedoms. Congress, dominated by radical Republicans who advocated for a more transformative Reconstruction, clashed with Johnson's policies. Congress also established the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, a federal agency designed to assist formerly enslaved individuals and impoverished Southerners. One of the most important strides during this era was in education. Reconstruction governments, despite these gains, the federal government's commitment to Reconstruction waned over time. The end of Reconstruction marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era, long period of legalized racial discrimination. Despite these setbacks, Reconstruction was a time of profound contradictions, a moment when America came closest to fulfilling its promise of equality, only to retreat into new forms of oppression. As the 19th century closed, the United States entered a period of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, setting the stage for new conflicts and transformations. As the 19th century gave way to the final decades, the United States entered a period known as the Gilded Age-an era of rapid industrialization. America shifted from a predominantly rural agrarian society to an urban industrial powerhouse. Factories multiplied, railroads crisscrossed the nation, and new technologies revolutionized production and communication. The populist movement, led by struggling farmers in the South and Midwest, demanded government regulation of railroads, a more flexible monetary system, and policies to help ordinary people. Progressives, A diverse group of reformers, including middle-class professionals, journalists, and politicians, aimed to tackle corruption, improve living conditions, expand democracy, and regulate big business. Figures like Theodore Roosevelt and Jane Addams emerged as leaders in this movement. While immigrants enriched the cultural fabric, they also faced discrimination, harsh labor conditions, and efforts to assimilate them into a dominant Anglo-American culture. The population exploded due to both natural growth and a massive wave of immigration from Europe and Asia. The Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896 upheld separate but equal segregation laws, trenching Jim Crow policies. These forces set the stage for the dramatic changes and challenges of the 20th century. African American leaders and communities persevered, though opportunities remained limited, fueling the demand for labor and reshaping the cultural landscape. The rise of public schools, universities, and libraries expanded access to knowledge. While writers and artists explored the realities of American life, often exposing social injustices, unprecedented economic growth, and social transformation. The term Gilded Age, the Spanish-American War in 1898, sparked by the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, and fueled by sensationalist journalism, resulted in the U.S. acquiring territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The victory signaled America's entrance onto the world stage as an imperial power. Coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, it suggested a society glittering with wealth and progress on the surface, but marked by deep inequalities, corruption, and social unrest beneath. Between roughly 1870 and 1900, industrial titans like Andrew Carnegie and Steel, John D. for all the rich is accumulated by the few, the vast majority of Americans faced harsh realities. Corruption was widespread, with scandals such as the Credit Mobilier and the Whiskey Ring eroding public trust. Yet, political participation was high, and reform movements gained momentum. Factory workers, including many recent immigrants, endured long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. Child labor was rampant, and labor unions struggled to gain recognition and improve workers' rights amid fierce opposition. Rockefeller and oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt and railroads, and J.P. Morgan and finance built vast empires that dominated markets and amassed immense wealth. Their influence extended beyond business into politics and philanthropy, shaping the nation's economic and social directions. Yet, cities grew rapidly, often chaotically, with tenement housing and inadequate sanitation creating breeding grounds for disease and poverty. The promise of the American dream seemed distant to many urban poor, while political machines like Tammany Hall controlled city politics through patronage and corruption. The era's politics reflected the tensions of a changing society. Amid these challenges, a growing number of Americans sought to address social and economic problems through activism and reform. Simultaneously, the seeds of the progressive era were being planted. Culturally, the period saw a flourishing of arts, literature, and education. Immigration reshaped American society dramatically. Millions of newcomers arrived from Southern and Eastern Europe, Asia, and other regions, bringing diverse languages, religions, and customs. Race relations remained deeply fraught. Despite the end of slavery, African Americans faced systemic discrimination, segregation, and violence, especially in the South. This period also marked America's emergence as a global power. The turn of the century was a time of contradictions, dazzling progress alongside profound inequality. Vibrant cultural growth shadowed by social tensions. As the 19th century closed, the United States stepped boldly into the progressive era period of widespread social activism and political reform spanning roughly from the 1890s to the 1920s. It was a time when the nation grappled with the challenges of rapid industrialization, urbanization, immigration. They aimed to address the excesses and inequalities unleashed during the Gilded Age, advocating for government regulation of big business, improved working conditions, expanded suffrage, and social justice, and political corruption, seeking to make democracy more responsive, fair, and just. Progressivism was not a single, unified movement, but rather a broad coalition of reformers, including middle-class professionals, politicians, journalists, educators, and labor activists. The suffrage movement gained momentum, culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote, a monumental victory that reshaped American democracy. They championed reforms such as the direct election of senators, initiatives, tragic events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, where over 140 workers died due to unsafe conditions, galvanized public support for workplace safety laws, child labor restrictions, and fairer wages. Labor unions grew stronger, although tensions between labor and capital often resulted in strikes and violent clashes, and referendums that gave citizens more power to shape laws, and the introduction of primaries to democratize party nominations. One of the defining features of the progressive era was the rise of investigative journalism known as muckraking. Writers like Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, and Lincoln Steffens exposed corruption in business and politics, poor labor conditions, and unsanitary practices in the food industry. Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which revealed horrifying conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants, led to public outcry and landmark legislation like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Politically, progressives fought to reduce the influence of political machines and monopolies. Women played a crucial role in the progressive movement. Leaders like Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in Chicago to assist immigrants and the poor, worked tirelessly on social reform. Labor reform was another major focus. The progressive era also saw efforts to address racial injustice, but though progress was uneven and often limited by pervasive racism. African American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois advocated for civil rights. Higher education, the Spanish-American War had marked the beginning of U.S. imperial ambitions, and the early 20th century saw interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean under the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, and later Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy, aimed to assert American influence and promote stability, often through military force. And political engagement, founding organizations like the NAACP in 1909. However, segregation and disenfranchisement persisted, especially in the South. Initially neutral, the U.S. entered the war in 1917 on the side of the Allies, motivated by threats to shipping, German unrestricted submarine warfare, and a vision of making the world safe for democracy, but also of deep contradictions, including racial tensions, restrictive immigration policies, and political conservatism. The era's cultural dynamism, from jazz music to the Harlem Renaissance, reflected a nation grappling with modernity. The war effort transformed the economy, accelerated social change, and enhanced America's status as a global power. On the international stage, America's role expanded significantly. World War I was a pivotal moment. The post-war period brought both optimism and turmoil. The Roaring Twenties was a decade of cultural innovation, economic prosperity, and social change. This period laid important groundwork for the challenges and upheavals of the 20th century. From the Great Depression to civil rights struggles, as the 19th century closed, the United States stepped boldly into the progressive era period of widespread social activism and political reform spanning roughly from the 1890s to the 1920s. It was a time when the nation grappled with the challenges of rapid industrialization, urbanization, immigration. They aimed to address the excesses and inequalities unleashed during the Gilded Age, advocating for government regulation of big business, improved working conditions, expanded suffrage, and social justice, and political corruption, seeking to make democracy more responsive, fair, and just. Progressivism was not a single, unified movement, but rather a broad coalition of reformers, including middle-class professionals, politicians, journalists, educators, and labor activists. The suffrage movement gained momentum, culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote, a monumental victory that reshaped American democracy. They championed reforms such as the direct election of senators, initiatives, tragic events like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, where over 140 workers died due to unsafe conditions, galvanized public support for workplace safety laws, child labor restrictions, and fairer wages. Labor unions grew stronger, although tensions between labor and capital often resulted in strikes and violent clashes, and referendums that gave citizens more power to shape laws, and the introduction of primaries to democratize party nominations. One of the defining features of the progressive era was the rise of investigative journalism known as muckraking. Writers like Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, and Lincoln Steffens exposed corruption in business and politics, poor labor conditions, and unsanitary practices in the food industry. Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which revealed horrifying conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants, led to public outcry and landmark legislation like the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Politically, progressives fought to reduce the influence of political machines and monopolies. Women played a crucial role in the progressive movement. Leaders like Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in Chicago to assist immigrants and the poor, worked tirelessly on social reform. Labor reform was another major focus. The progressive era also saw efforts to address racial injustice, but though progress was uneven and often limited by pervasive racism. African American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois advocated for civil rights. Higher education, the Spanish-American War had marked the beginning of U.S. imperial ambitions, and the early 20th century saw interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean under the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, and later Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy, aimed to assert American influence and promote stability, often through military force. And political engagement, founding organizations like the NAACP in 1909. However, segregation and disenfranchisement persisted, especially in the South. Initially neutral, the U.S. entered the war in 1917 on the side of the Allies, motivated by threats to shipping, German unrestricted submarine warfare, and a vision of making the world safe for democracy, but also of deep contradictions, including racial tensions, restrictive immigration policies, and political conservatism. The era's cultural dynamism, from jazz music to the Harlem Renaissance, reflected a nation grappling with modernity. The war effort transformed the economy, accelerated social change, and enhanced America's status as a global power. On the international stage, America's role expanded significantly. World War I was a pivotal moment. The post-war period brought both optimism and turmoil. The Roaring Twenties was a decade of cultural innovation, economic prosperity, and social change. This period laid important groundwork for the challenges and upheavals of the 20th century. From the Great Depression to civil rights struggles, the 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, were marked by a vibrant cultural shift, economic prosperity, and profound social change. However, beneath this gleaming surface, deep economic weaknesses were growing. Setting the stage for the greatest economic crisis in American history, the Great Depression, the decade saw a booming stock market, rapid industrial growth, and rising consumerism. Automobiles became more affordable thanks to Henry Ford's assembly line, transforming American life by enabling mobility and reshaping cities and suburbs. New technologies like radio and cinema revolutionized entertainment, creating a shared national culture and launching celebrities into the public spotlight. By 1933, nearly a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed, and the economy was in freefall. However, this prosperity was not evenly distributed. Many farmers, minorities, and industrial workers did not share in the economic boom. The Dust Bowl, severe drought combined with poor farming practices devastated the agricultural heartland, forcing thousands of Okies and others to migrate west in search of work. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress administration employed millions while building infrastructure and supporting the arts. His reluctance to provide direct relief deepened public despair and anger. Yet it fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the American people and their government, establishing a safety net and a new vision of federal responsibility. Income inequality widened, and credit expansion led to risky investments and inflated stock prices. Speculation fueled a financial bubble that would burst disastrously. Writers like John Steinbeck captured the struggles of ordinary Americans, while folk and blues music gave voice to pain and resilience. The stock market crash of October 1929 sent shockwaves across the nation. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. In the United States, Roosevelt's policies sought to protect the nation while maintaining democratic ideals. Roosevelt's New Deal was a series of sweeping programs and reforms aimed at relief, recovery, and reform, culminating in the outbreak of World War II in 1939 initially committed to neutrality. The U.S. gradually shifted toward support for the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease. The war effort mobilized the entire nation, ending the Depression and transforming society. It expanded the federal government's role in the economy and society in unprecedented ways. The Great Depression was not merely an economic downturn, but a social catastrophe. Families faced hunger and homelessness. Breadlines and soup kitchens became grim symbols of the era. President Herbert Hoover's response was widely criticized as inadequate. Rooted in a belief that the economy would self-correct without heavy government intervention, the 1932 election brought a decisive shift with the victory of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal for the American people. New Deal initiatives created jobs through public works projects, established Social Security, introduced unemployment insurance, and regulated banking and the stock market to prevent future collapses. The New Deal faced opposition from conservatives who feared government overreach and from progressives who argued it didn't go far enough. Culturally, the era saw a flourishing of literature, music, and art that reflected the hardships and hopes of the time. Internationally, the Great Depression had global repercussions, fueling political instability and extremism. As the 1930s progressed, global tensions escalated. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, thrust America fully into the global conflict. World War II, spanning from 1939 to 1945, was a cataclysmic event that reshaped the global order and fundamentally transformed the United States. Though initially reluctant to enter the war, the U.S. became the arsenal of democracy and ultimately the decisive force that helped defeat fascism and reshape the post-war world. As Axis powers Germany, Italy, and Japan expanded their reach, democracies around the world grappled with the threat. The assault destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet, killing over 2,400 Americans and galvanizing public opinion. Factories that once made consumer goods now produce tanks, planes, ships, and weapons at a breathtaking pace. The U.S. military innovated with new technologies like radar, jet engines, and the atomic bomb, which would later become the defining and most controversial weapon of the war. The government coordinated resources and labor, rationed goods, and promoted war bonds to finance military operations. African Americans served valiantly in segregated units and pressed for civil rights through the Double V campaign: victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. The war's contradictions sparked early momentum for the civil rights movement. The next day, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and shortly after on Germany and Italy, entering a truly global conflict. This violation of civil liberties was justified by fear and prejudice, but later acknowledged as a grave injustice. The bombings remain a subject of ethical debate, underscoring the devastating power of nuclear weapons. In Europe, the D-Day invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was a turning point. These brutal battles highlighted the intensity of the conflict and the high cost of victory. Allied forces stormed the beaches and began liberating Western Europe from Nazi occupation. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, was fiercely contested, but ultimately failed. The United States, still recovering from the Great Depression and wary of another costly conflict, adopted a policy of neutrality while gradually increasing aid to Allied nations. The war began in Europe in 1939 when Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. This changed dramatically on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The United States emerged as a superpower, playing a central role in founding the United Nations and shaping the post-war world order. The mobilization for war was massive and unprecedented. The entire American economy shifted to support the war effort. It redefined America's identity and responsibilities on the global stage. Millions of Americans joined the armed forces, fighting across multiple theaters: Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, and Asia. Iconic figures like Rosie the Riveter symbolize the strength and patriotism of women laboring in factories, shipyards, and offices. This shift challenged traditional gender roles and laid groundwork for future social change. The home front experienced profound changes. Women entered the workforce in huge numbers to fill the gaps left by men serving overseas. Despite the unity forged by the war effort, racial segregation and discrimination persisted. Japanese Americans faced one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history, and over 120,000 were forcibly relocated to internment camps. Major battles shaped the course of the war. In the Pacific, the island-hopping campaign brought U.S. forces closer to Japan, capturing key islands like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The war culminated with the U.S. dropping atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, hastening Japan's surrender and ending the war. World War II ended with over 400,000 American deaths and immense global destruction. Yet it also ushered in a new era. The war accelerated social change at home and abroad, sowing seeds for the Cold War, civil rights movements, and decolonization. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 marked the dawn of a new, intense era in global politics, the Cold War. This nearly half-century-long conflict was not fought on traditional battlefields, but was a struggle for influence. Ideology and power between the United States and the Soviet Union, the U.S. sought to promote democracy, capitalism, and free markets worldwide, while the Soviet Union aimed to spread communism and extend its control over Eastern Europe and beyond. The fear of communist infiltration and espionage sparked a wave of political paranoia known as McCarthyism. It's named after Senator Joseph McCarthy. The competition to outpace the Soviet Union led to the space race, culminating in the U.S. landing astronauts on the moon in 1969, a defining achievement symbolizing American ingenuity and determination. Nuclear weapons development escalated, with both superpowers amassing massive arsenals capable of global destruction, resulting in the doctrine of mutually assured destruction that maintained a precarious peace. With you as the 1950s idealized suburban life, and arms control agreements, such as the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, sought to ease tensions. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the definitive end of the Cold War, leaving the United States as the sole superpower. Consumerism and traditional family values, but beneath the surface, artists, writers, and musicians pushed boundaries, reflecting and shaping changing attitudes. The Beat Generation, rock, and roll, and the countercultural movements of the 1960s challenged conformity and authority. The contradiction between fighting for freedom abroad and denying it to African Americans at home became increasingly untenable. Landmark moments such as the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision is declared school segregation unconstitutional, and the courageous activism of figures like Martin Luther King Jr. helped challenge systemic racism. Lead forces, battling communist North Korea and China in a brutal stalemate that ended with the peninsula divided to this day. In Southeast Asia, the U.S. deepened its involvement, culminating in the prolonged and divisive Vietnam War, which would have profound impacts on American society and politics. Accusations of communist sympathies ruined careers and lives. While government agencies like the FBI increased surveillance and repression, this Red Scare created a climate of fear that stifled dissent and raised profound questions about civil liberties. This ideological divide fueled a series of proxy wars, arms races, and political confrontations known collectively as the Cold War. It shaped the trajectory of American history from the late 1940s through the late 1980s, affecting every aspect of society. From politics and culture to science and foreign policy, fear, conflict, and progress that defined modern America's place in the world. As the war ended, the alliance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union quickly dissolved into suspicion and rivalry. We will examine the social revolutions and cultural transformations of the 1960s and 1970s, a time of upheaval and change. Domestically, the Cold War led to significant changes in American society. At the same time, the Cold War spurred remarkable advancements in science and technology. Foreign policy during the Cold War was marked by interventions and alliances aimed at containing communism. The Truman Doctrine established a policy of supporting free peoples resisting subjugation, which led to U.S. involvement in Greece, Turkey, and later Vietnam and Korea. The Marshall Plan provided billions in aid to rebuild Western Europe, fostering economic recovery and political stability. The Korean War was the first hot conflict of the Cold War. Civil rights struggles gained momentum during the Cold War, the Cold War era also saw cultural shifts. By the late 20th century, this period's legacy is complex, a mix of innovation. Up next, the 1960s and 1970s stand as one of the most tumultuous, transformative, and culturally rich periods in American history. These 2 decades were defined by social revolutions, political upheaval, and a powerful challenge to the status quo. African Americans, galvanized by decades of systemic discrimination and inspired by leaders Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and organizations such as the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, pushed for legal equality, voting rights, and an end to segregation. The movement combined nonviolent protest, civil disobedience, and powerful oratory to draw national and international attention. From the fight for civil rights to the anti-war movement, from countercultural expressions to landmark legislation, this era reshaped the nation's identity and values in lasting ways. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, marked major victories. Initially supported as part of the broader Cold War effort to contain communism, the war became increasingly controversial as casualties mounted and the conflict dragged on. Graphic media coverage brought the brutal realities of war into American living rooms, fueling widespread anti-war protests and cultural dissent. Violent resistance from segregationists, police brutality, and deep societal divisions led to unrest and tragedy. The war exposed generational divides and deepened mistrust of government, especially after revelations like the Pentagon Papers, which exposed official deception about the war's progress. The counterculture embraced peace, love, and alternative lifestyles. Embodied in events like the 1969 Woodstock Festival, First Earth Day in 1970, symbolized a new commitment to conservation and environmental justice. Music, art, and literature challenged conventional norms and celebrated freedom and experimentation. While landmark legislation expanded civil rights and social welfare programs, conservative forces mobilized in response to the perceived excesses of the era, setting the stage for political realignments, such as the Birmingham Campaign's confrontations and the assassination of prominent leaders, including John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy. The Black Power movement emerged, advocating for racial pride, self-determination, and, in some factions, more militant stances. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 further dismantled barriers to political participation for African Americans, reshaping the political landscape. The civil rights movement, which had begun in earnest during the 1950s, reached its peak during the 1960s. Key moments like the 1963 March on Washington, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, the Freedom Rides challenging segregation in interstate travel, yet the struggle was far from over. Parallel to the civil rights struggle, other marginalized groups began to assert their rights and identities. The women's liberation movement gained momentum, challenging traditional gender roles, fighting for workplace equality, reproductive rights, and an end to discrimination. Landmark moments included the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, the formation of the National Organization for Women, and the push for the Equal Rights Amendment. The LGBTQ+ community also started to organize more visibly, culminating in the 1969 Stonewall riots, a pivotal event in the fight for gay rights. The Vietnam War loomed large over this era, profoundly affecting American society and politics. College campuses became hotbeds of activism, with students organizing demonstrations, draft resistance, and teach-ins. The cultural landscape exploded with new expressions of rebellion and creativity. The environmental movement also emerged, sparked by growing awareness of pollution and ecological damage. Politically, these decades saw both progress and backlash. Economic challenges, including inflation and energy crises in the 1970s, added to a sense of uncertainty. In some, the 1960s and 1970s were decades of profound change, conflict, and creativity that challenged America to live up to its ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. The late 1970s and 1980s ushered in an era of significant economic and political transformation in the United States, marked by the rise of conservatism, the redefinition of American identity, and an assertive global posture. After the social upheavals of the previous decades, many Americans sought stability, traditional values, and economic revitalization, leading to a conservative wave that reshaped the nation. Rising unemployment and inflation undermined public confidence. The Watergate scandal, culminating in President Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974, deepened cynicism about government and leadership. These challenges eroded trust in institutions and fueled a desire for new directions. The 1970s were challenging economically. The decade was marred by stagflation, a rare combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation, along with an energy crisis triggered by OPEC oil embargoes. Reagan's charisma, optimistic vision, and belief in limited government, free market economics, and strong national defense resonated with many Americans. And early developments in the internet, which began to transform daily life, work, and communication. The decade saw the growth of the yuppie culture, an emphasis on consumerism and a booming entertainment industry with icons like Michael Jackson and Madonna. However, issues such as the AIDS crisis exposed social stigmas and galvanized activism, particularly within the LGBTQ community. America emerged triumphant, but new challenges loomed on the horizon. His administration championed supply-side economics, popularly known as Reaganomics, which emphasized tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced social spending to stimulate growth. Against this backdrop, Ronald Reagan's presidential victory in 1980 symbolized a conservative resurgence. Economic disparities persisted, and debates over immigration, education, and healthcare shaped political discourse. And the complexities of globalization, technology, social change that would define the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Reagan's economic policies sparked debate. Supporters credited them with a robust economic recovery, job creation, and a resurgence of American confidence. Critics argued they increased income inequality and federal deficits. Nevertheless, Reagan's influence profoundly shaped the political landscape, inspiring a conservative coalition that would dominate for decades, and strategic initiatives like the Strategic Defense Initiative, aiming to outpace Soviet capabilities. Yet, Reagan also engaged in important arms control negotiations, culminating in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, signaling a thaw in Cold War tensions. On the international stage, the Reagan administration took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, ramping up military spending. The decade witnessed major technological advances, including the rise of personal computers, the expansion of cable television, socially and culturally. The 1980s reflected a complex mix of conservatism and vibrant diversity. The war on drugs intensified, leading to mass incarceration and ongoing debates about criminal justice. By the decade's close, the Cold War's final chapter unfolded, as Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms that eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This period set the stage for the United States' transition into a post-Cold War world. Next, we'll delve into the post-Cold War era, exploring America's evolving role on the world stage and domestic challenges in the 1990s and early 2000s. The post-Cold War era, beginning in the early 1990s, marked a period of profound transformation for the United States, both internationally and domestically. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the U.S. emerged as the world's sole superpower, poised to shape a new global order. The Gulf War in 1990-1991 was a defining moment early in the decade. When Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, U.S. led a broad coalition to liberate the territory through Operation Desert Storm, demonstrating its military might and commitment to protecting vital interests in the Middle East. Yet, its newfound dominance came with fresh challenges and complexities that would test America's political, economic, and social fabric. The U.S. played key roles in the Balkans to halt ethnic conflicts and humanitarian crises, notably in Bosnia and Kosovo. The Rodney King beating in 1991 and subsequent Los Angeles riots highlighted ongoing racial tensions and police brutality. The 1990s also witnessed the tragic Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, a stark reminder of domestic terrorism threats. The attacks of September 11, 2001 by al-Qaeda terrorists fundamentally altered the nation's trajectory. The tragedy claimed nearly 3,000 lives and triggered the War on Terror, leading to prolonged conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. The decade saw progress in LGBTQ rights, with increased visibility and activism, though many legal and societal challenges remained. However, the decade exposed the limits of American power and the complexities of intervention in ethnic and regional disputes. The aftermath influenced foreign policy for decades and raised questions about America's role in the world. However, political polarization began to intensify, epitomized by the impeachment proceedings against Clinton in the late 1990s, which exposed deep partisan divides. Internationally, the 1990s saw the U.S. engage in various military interventions, peacekeeping missions, and diplomatic efforts aimed at maintaining global stability. This period also witnessed efforts to promote democracy and free markets around the world, often dubbed the end of history moment, where liberal democracy appeared ascendant. Back home, the 1990s were marked by economic expansion, technological innovation, and shifting social dynamics. The rise of the internet and information technology revolutionized business, communication, and culture, ushering in the digital age. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and emerging internet giants transformed the economy and daily life. The decade also saw relative prosperity, low unemployment, and budget surpluses under President Bill Clinton's administration. It navigated centrist policies, welfare reform, and a focus on fiscal responsibility. Socially, the U.S. grappled with issues around race, gender, and identity. At the same time, debates over immigration, healthcare, and education shaped public discourse. Entering the 21st century, the United States appeared poised for continued leadership, but soon faced transformative shocks. Domestically, 9/11s reshaped security policies, civil liberties, and national identity, fostering both unity and debate over government power. This era of transition set the stage for ongoing challenges in governance, technology, and global relations as the U.S. confronted a rapidly changing world. The next section will explore the complexities of the 21st century technological breakthroughs, cultural shifts, and political challenges that continue to define America today. The 21st century, now well underway, has been a time of rapid change. It's unprecedented technological advancement and deep political and social challenges for the United States. The country continues to grapple with its evolving identity, the balance between security and freedom, and its place in an increasingly interconnected world. The war on terror became the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy, with military operations in Afghanistan aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban from power. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified by concerns over weapons of mass destruction, became deeply controversial as the initial swift military victory gave way to a prolonged insurgency. Sectarian violence and complex nation-building efforts. Following the tragic events of September 11, 2001, America's focus shifted dramatically. These conflicts strained American military resources and sparked intense debate about interventionism, national security, and the costs of war, both human and financial. The rise of the internet and smartphones transformed how Americans communicate, access information, and engage politically and socially. The LGBTQ+ community achieved historic milestones, including the legalization of same-sex marriage nationwide in 2015. While ongoing struggles for racial justice have brought systemic inequalities under renewed scrutiny, social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube reshaped public discourse, creating new opportunities for connection but also challenges, including misinformation, polarization, and debates about privacy. Breakthroughs in medicine, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence hold promise for the future. Even as society grapples with ethical and practical implications, the U.S. played both leadership and reluctant roles in global climate agreements, reflecting tensions between economic interests and environmental responsibility. The wars also heightened domestic concerns about civil liberties, surveillance, and immigration policies. At the same time, the United States experienced seismic shifts in technology and culture. The nation's resilience and capacity to adapt continue to shape its story. Economically, the 2008 financial crisis was a major turning point. The collapse of major financial institutions led to a global recession with widespread job losses, home foreclosures, and economic insecurity. The government responded with massive bailouts and stimulus packages, sparking debates over regulation, inequality, and the role of government in the economy. Politically, the early 21st century has been marked by increasing polarization and partisanship. Key elections and legislative battles reflected deep divides over healthcare, migration, climate change, and social justice issues. Movements like the Tea Party on the right and Black Lives Matter on the left highlighted growing demands for political change and representation. Culturally, debates over race, gender, and identity have come to the forefront. Environmental concerns gained urgency as climate change impacts became more visible. Despite challenges, America's innovation and cultural dynamism remain vibrant. This ongoing chapter of American history is defined by complexity balancing tradition and change, unity and division, opportunity and challenge. Next, we will examine contemporary America in greater depth, exploring the social, political, and technological forces shaping its present and future. As we move further into the 21st century, America stands at a crossroads defined by rapid technological innovation, shifting demographics, and evolving cultural landscapes. The forces shaping contemporary society are both complex and intertwined, influencing how people live, work, and relate to one another, and how the nation navigates its future. The United States is becoming increasingly diverse, with minority populations growing rapidly due to immigration and changing birth rates. This multicultural tapestry brings rich cultural contributions, but also new challenges in social cohesion and political representation. Issues of identity, belonging, and equity are central to public discourse. As debates over immigration policies, voting rights, and social justice continue to play pivotal roles in shaping national policy, one of the most striking transformations is the demographic shift. While innovation has driven growth and created new opportunities, many Americans face economic insecurity, wage stagnation, and challenges accessing affordable housing, education, and healthcare. Conversations about systemic racism, gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, and indigenous peoples' sovereignty have gained prominence, pushing institutions and communities to confront uncomfortable truths and work toward reconciliation and reform. The debate over how to build an equitable economy that works for all remains central. Technological advancements have accelerated at a dizzying pace. The rise of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation promises to revolutionize industries and daily life. From healthcare and education to transportation and communication, climate change poses existential threats through extreme weather, rising sea levels, and biodiversity loss. How the nation navigates these currents will define its path for generations to come. The U.S. has seen both policy advances aimed at reducing carbon emissions and setbacks due to political disagreements, reflecting the complexity of balancing economic growth with sustainability. Issues such as healthcare reform, climate change, racial justice, economic inequality, and immigration continue to dominate political debates. OFTEN highlighting stark divisions across party lines and regions. It exposed inequalities, reshaped work and education through remote technologies, and sparked debates over science, governance, and individual freedoms. At the same time, grassroots movements and increased political participation by younger generations signal an engaged citizenry striving for change. From breakthroughs in renewable energy to movements demanding justice and equity, Americans are actively shaping the country's evolving identity. However, these technologies also raise critical ethical questions about privacy, job displacement, and the digital divide, how access to technology remains uneven across different communities and regions. Social media, having matured over the past 2 decades, remains a powerful force in shaping public opinion, political mobilization, and cultural trends. While it has democratized information sharing and connected communities, it has also contributed to polarization, misinformation, and challenges to traditional journalism. Society grapples with finding a balance between free expression and accountability in the digital realm. Politically, the United States faces ongoing polarization that impacts governance and civic engagement. Economically, the country contends with the legacies of globalization and automation. Culturally, America continues to celebrate diversity while wrestling with its historical legacies. Environmental concerns have moved to the forefront of national priorities. The COVID-19 pandemic, a defining event of the early 2020s, tested America's public health infrastructure, economic resilience, and social fabric. Despite these challenges, the nation's spirit of innovation, activism, and resilience continues to inspire hope. As we look forward, America's story remains a dynamic, one marked by the tension between change and tradition, conflict and cooperation, division and unity. The next section will reflect on America's foundational values, the ongoing quest to fulfill its promises, and the lessons history offers for the future. To truly understand the trajectory of the United States and envision its future, it's essential to return to its foundational values principles, like liberty, equality, democracy, and justice, that have both guided and challenged the nation throughout its history. The story of America is in many ways the story of a continuous struggle to live up to these ideals amid evolving social, political, and economic realities. From the moment of its founding, the United States embraced revolutionary concepts that all people possess certain inalienable rights and that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. The existence of slavery, the displacement of Native American peoples, the long struggle for voting rights, civil rights, and gender equality show that the path toward justice has been arduous and incomplete. Each generation has grappled with these contradictions, seeking to expand the circle of inclusion and redefine what America means. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights laid the groundwork for a political system committed to freedom, rule of law, and the protection of individual rights. Yet the nation's history reveals persistent contradictions. Understanding history not just as a series of events, but as a living conversation about identity and values, can empower citizens to address present challenges thoughtfully. The Civil War was a profound crucible that tested the Union's commitment to these principles, resulting in the abolition of slavery, but also ushering in new challenges during Reconstruction and beyond. The past teaches that progress is neither inevitable nor linear, requires vigilance, courage, and collective effort. The 20th century brought monumental progress through the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, and the ongoing fight for equality for all marginalized groups. The tension between promoting democracy and human rights abroad while confronting domestic shortcomings is a recurring theme. The nation's power carries responsibilities and dilemmas, especially in a complex, multipolar world where values often clash with strategic interests. Yet systemic inequalities and social injustices remain entrenched. Democracy itself faces tests in the 21st century. Political polarization, misinformation, and questions about voting access challenge the health of the republic. The ideal of an informed and engaged citizenry is as critical now as ever to sustaining democratic institutions. America's foundational values also inform its role on the global stage. Education, civic engagement, and open dialogue emerge as crucial tools for the nation's ongoing renewal. Looking forward, the promise of America lies in its ability to embrace diversity, innovate, and foster a society where all individuals can thrive. As we reflect on these themes, it becomes clear that the American experiment is ongoing, a dynamic process shaped by the actions and aspirations of its people. In the final section, we'll tie together these historical threads and explore the broad lessons that America's past offers for its future path. As we conclude this comprehensive journey through the entire history of the United States, it's important to reflect on the broad lessons that emerge from the nation's complex and multifaceted story. The United States has been shaped by ideals and contradictions, innovation and conflict, expansion and inclusion. Understanding this history provides not only context for the present, but guidance for the future. One of the most enduring lessons is the power and fragility of democracy. The American system, built on checks and balances, separation of powers, and individual rights, has proven remarkably resilient despite repeated tests of civil war, social upheaval, economic crises, and political polarization. History teaches that isolationism and unilateralism often fall short in a world where challenges transcend borders. Embracing this diversity while fostering unity and mutual respect remains a crucial task. Yet democracy requires constant nurturing through active citizen participation, respect for the rule of law, and protection of civil liberties. Despite setbacks, divisions, and hardships, the nation has repeatedly found ways to reform, rebuild, and pursue a more just society. Understanding the past equips us to engage with the present critically and to help shape a future that lives up to the nation's highest ideals. Economic growth, scientific discovery, and cultural creativity have propelled the nation forward, enabling it to overcome adversity and remain a global leader. At the same time, technological and social changes bring new dilemmas, requiring thoughtful approaches to ethics, equity, and sustainability. May this journey inspire curiosity, understanding, and a commitment to the shared values that continue to define this nation. Another key theme is the ongoing struggle to expand the promises of liberty and equality to all people. From the struggles of enslaved Africans and Native Americans to the fight for women's suffrage, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, and immigrant inclusion, the narrative of America is one of progress forged through persistence and sacrifice. This unfinished work challenges each generation to confront injustice and inequality wherever they appear. The United States' history also highlights the profound impact of innovation and adaptability. The environment and global interconnectedness are increasingly central concerns. America's future depends on how it addresses climate change, resource management, and international cooperation. Cultural diversity is a defining strength. The tapestry of immigrant and indigenous cultures has enriched American life and contributed to its dynamism. Finally, the story of the United States is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for reinvention and hope. As viewers, reflecting on this history invites us to become active participants in the ongoing American story. Thank you for joining this in-depth exploration of the entire history of the United States.